and welcome to the British Sitcom History Podcast. My name is Alan. With me, as always, is Gareth.
Hello.
And today we are going to somewhat of an obscure 80s sitcom.
Very of its time.
Very of its time. That being Whoops Apocalypse, which is a political satire set in the heart of the Cold War, with the threat of World War III around the corner. Now, to get this started straight off, yes, this is very of its time. It is very much puncturing the political landscape as it was in 1982 when this came out. We're going to talk
a lot about the. We're going to talk about the sitcom, of course, but we're going to talk a little bit about the politics which it is satirising.
Which is difficult for me, I must admit, and even watching this, I think some things didn't hit because I'm too young.
Well, I was only 6 when this went out, but what was interesting for me, and we'll obviously get into this in more detail, this was made in 1982, and it's interesting when you look back at the 80s and the sort of Reagan era, you've got the hindsight of the whole thing having happened, but this was made very early in the 80s, and so it was kind of before Reagan, before Thatcher had really got into their stride, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so it feels a little bit more of the 70s than the 80s in terms of the politics of it. But right. I guess we'll get into that detail.
And yeah, I'm sort of relying on you here because I think I do kind of understand the general vibe of it, but you being a bit more of a history nerd and a politics nerd, I think you might be able to give me a bit more insight.
Well, shall we give the general vibe? I mean, the general vibe is, it's a sort of spoof of, we've got the Oval Office, the American president, we've got the Kremlin, the Russian Central Committee of the Politburo, and there's a bomb, and there's a kidnapping, and there's essentially the threat of a nuclear war, and that's what we were all worried about in the 80s. And we see the British cabinet, and we see master criminal, and it's, we keep using the word satire. I'm going to tip my hand here. I don't think this is very good, Alan. And the satire is house brick level. It's not Jonathan Swift. It is sixth form level satire.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Well, perhaps on that note, we should talk about the writers first.
Yeah, okay, because the writers have got good pedigree.
So, the writers of Whoops Apocalypse are Andrew Marshall and David Renwick. Names we are familiar with in the sitcom world. Not least, we've spoken of David Renwick on this show before because we covered One Foot in the Grave.
One Foot in the Grave, of course, yeah.
Probably his best known work, albeit one of many. So, we have talked about David Renwick in quite considerable detail in the past, so I'm not going to go over it too much, but let's talk about more his work with Andrew Marshall.
I'd like to ask how old he was when this... basically, I like One Foot in the Grave, but it was many years after this. It was a decade after this. Was this... What had he done? Was he still 17 when he wrote this?
No, but they were young. They were very young and started young. So let me sort of get into the history of Marshall and Renwick a little bit. They were a writing duo for quite some years before they ended up getting more success individually. Both of them, just as young teens, were interested in writing and liked writing comedy and that sort of thing. David Renwick became a journalist for his local paper. That was his kind of writing outlet. Andrew Marshall, basically as a teenager, was sending things into the BBC for the radio shows that would just kind of accept gags and one-liners and would pay you per line. That was while he was still at school even. He was that young. They met in the writer's room for Week Ending. So Week Ending was weekly political satire show. It was, here's the week's news, and we're going to, take a sideways glance at the week's news.
I've heard of Week Ending because I think, didn't it go on for quite a long time? There's a lot of comedy writers have gone through that system. Yeah,
exactly. Week Ending was literally an open door kind of writer's room. Anyone could send stuff in. It was a sketch show and one-liner gags and things. Also, there was literally a writer's room you could come and kind of work on stuff with the people, and it was a great way to meet people and network, even if you weren't getting a lot of work out of it. Not just writers, but also a lot of producers cut their teeth on it. John Lloyd, at this kind of time, he's connected with these guys. Armando Iannucci later on, those types of people. And Marshall and Renwick both kind of ended up there. and met each other there were the two who weren't the Oxbridge public school boys, so they kind of connected with each other.
Listen, I am really surprised by that, because when I said earlier this house brick satire, it's got a real Footlights feel to it.
Yeah, I mean, they were of that world still, obviously, but they were not through that chain. They were not.
Well,
they were not from...
let's be honest. That's my prejudice, isn't it? That's my prejudice, my chippiness showing, isn't it? But yeah, it's got the show has that feel of let's put on a jolly show for everybody.
Well, I find that interesting because my interest in Whoops Apocalypse is not so much as its content, but its place in history and in sitcom history. It really is one of the major connecting points between the old 60s satire boom, sort of David Frost and the Python and all that sort of stuff, Peter Cook, connecting to the alternative comedy of the 80s, which obviously some of that alternative comedy still comes from the Oxbridge connection, but then you've got the likes of Ben Elton, Rick Mayall, all that sort of stuff.
Well, we've got Rick Mayall and Alexis Sale appearing here.
Yes, exactly. But I think Marshall and Renwick really are glue between them. That when they started so young. So David Renwick born in 1951, Andrew Marshall 1954. Right. So by the time this show came out, they were 30, 27. But had been already writing for several years by that point. And had started writing for the likes of Spike Milligan, the two Ronnies, like old school guys, and all sketches and gags. That's what they did. Off the back of this, they got their own show on radio. The Burkiss Way was, which was again a fairly anarchic sketch show. Owes a lot to Monty Python and the Goon Show, that sort of stuff.
Was anyone famous in that, in the Burkiss Way?
Names from the time that you would kind of recognise. But here's an interesting one. Denise Coffey was in it, and she was part of the team on Do Not Adjust Your Set, which was kind of a start for some of the Pythons, and David Jason was involved in it. And indeed, in the late 70s, do you remember when we talked about Only Fools and Horses and the sort of history of David Jason pre-Fools?
Yes.
Well, Renwick and Marshall apparently wrote a couple of pilot scripts for David Jason at LWT. When they were just desperately trying to get David Jason
to find something for him.
Yeah, and like none of those, we didn't talk about either of those shows. They didn't come to anything, but they were part of that process.
I see.
And so the Burkiss Way, their show in the radio, was a bit more of that, like, oh, we're getting slightly anarchic. Oh, this is very Python-esque, isn't it? Kind of thing. Off the back of that, they then want to do a TV show, which is essentially the same thing. It's a sketch show with their writing with similar kind of themes. The BBC choose not to do it, and so they take it to LWT.
Right.
Now, this was because Simon Brett, who was a radio producer who'd worked with them, he'd moved to LWT, and so he kind of said, oh, come over here, I'll get you in with Humphrey Barclay, the producer behind Desmond's, and he was the head of comedy at LWT. Yes, he commissioned a TV show called End of Part 1, which was a sort of anarchic sketch show. There's
a lot of anarchic sketch shows about, wasn't there?
Well, there was a bit of talk of like, oh, you're trying to do not the 9 o'clock news kind of thing, which is, unfair. It was, they kind of developed from their own thing and all that. But this is the sort of thing that's going on at this time, yes. So End of Part 1 is kind of the ITV, I don't really recognise any of these people, equivalent of, Rowan Atkinson and Smith and Jones and all this sort of people. However, End of Part 1 was not a huge success, and part of the reason for that was it was put in quite an early time slot. And trying to kind of aim it at kids a little bit, even though it wasn't written for that, but the producers sort of put it there, and that kind of caused some problems. So Marshall and Renwick decided, as a sort of antidote to that, to write the most kind of adult thing they could think of that wasn't appropriate for kids. And that is basically what ended up being Whoops Apocalypse.
Well, we can talk about some of well, let's just cut to the chase. There's a topless newsreader in this episode. And that... I mean, I'm not prudish by any means, but it felt to me like, oh look, tits. Hey! Yeah. It felt so sixth form.
I was going to ask you to, is there a joke there that I'm not getting? Is there some reference to something at the time? But there isn't.
I think they're satirising American television in general, but I don't know.
Because the nature of that scene is that it's a British newsreader. That's kind of
I don't know. I guess what they're saying is that it's always there was a sort of a stereotype that the two newsreaders would be an old grey man and a younger, more attractive woman. But, I'm talking about Angela Rippon, not Samantha Fox.
Yeah, I didn't get that at all, really. I
don't know. I don't know what it was satirising. All I know was, and again, I love a lovely pair of tits. Like, I got no objection in principle, but it felt so out of place. Yeah, exactly. It just felt like, hey, we've made a programme for grown-ups. We can put whatever we want in it. Here's some tits, way.
Yeah, I agree. I don't quite get that. But let's jump back in. Marshall and Renwick write a pilot for Whoops Apocalypse. They give it into the BBC. John Howard Davis, who was the control of comedy at the time, goes, this is crap, Mum don't want to do this. And so they take it back to LWT, where they've just been working. They take it to Humphrey Barclay. He likes it. He says, let's make it. They make a pilot, which is lost now, but it does appear to be fairly close to episode 1 of the series, and with quite a few similar cast members as well. Off the back of that, it was good enough that they decided to make the series. So that's kind of where we're at. It's 1981. The series is commissioned and written. So let's talk about the show a little bit before we jump into a specific episode, because it is, we're calling it a sitcom, but it is an ongoing narrative. It is a continuing narrative.
Yeah.
And it is also very sketchy.
We've struggled over the years to define sitcom. And yes, this is not episodic in the sense that it doesn't reset. It has got an ongoing storyline.
Well, we've had this with sitcoms before in terms of like how sharply do you define a sitcom? And we've had both examples of, well, is this a conglomerate of sketches with a sort of narrative line, or is this an ongoing drama that is lighthearted? This manages to do both at the same time.
and badly. No, listen, I'm sorry. I think I've made my point here about I didn't like it. So I'm going to shut up a bit. Let's just talk about it and try and be a little bit more objective.
Yeah, but it's a fair point. And but yeah, so it's not really a traditional sitcom. It feels like sketches connected together, but with a narrative to hold them all together. And in that sense, it's kind of divided up into sections, into characters, the sketch characters. We have the American president and his advisor, the British Prime Minister and his cabinet, and the Russian premier. And then a couple other bits and pieces, such as John Cleese as L'Acrobat, a sort of international assassin. We'll talk about him later.
The Shah of Iran. We have the Shah of Iran stranded on a ferry.
The Shah of Iran. Plus, we have other fairly randomly thrown in gags and sketches that don't bear a lot.
Yeah, so we've got a fake American newscaster. We've got the British News at 10. We've also got fake adverts, which is quite an interesting thing. It's like in RoboCop, where they make, like, Pels Verhoeven makes fake adverts. It's kind of aspiring to that same level of satire.
Yeah, but at the same time, none of it quite hits, does it? It all just sort of misses. And
I would not buy that for $1.
You know what? Let's get into an episode and kind of start to break it down a bit, because I think we need to sort of address each bit by bit.
Yeah, what we've decided to do, because we always pick an episode, so we have done that. We've picked episode 2. There's only one series, episode 2, and we're going to go through that. But I think what we're going to do is, as we see each of our settings, the British, the American, the Russian, we'll talk about that in a bit more broad terms, and I hate to tell our listeners, but we are probably going to spoil the ending of Whoops Apocalypse right now. So do go and watch. No, don't. Do go and watch it before you listen to it. Don't. So as we are gonna look at this episode, but we're going to talk about the whole series in general. I think a bit like we did with Fleabag, I suppose.
Yeah, and the other problem here as well is that although there are these sort of set characters that we go back to every time, they're not all in every episode, and so
that's right. So
trying to find an episode that had everything. Yeah, there's no Russians in this episode, so we'll have to deal with them separately. But I was trying to find an episode that they were all in, and the only one is the very last episode, which is a bit too kind of wrapping everything up to be a good one for us to look at. Yeah. So yeah, it's I hadn't realised that when watching it though, which is I thought was interesting. But let's look at episode 2 of the series, because they're still sort of establishing characters and still setting things up, but we're sort of well underway by this point. So that is Autumn Cannibalism, so episode 2.
Oh, I forgot I had a name, yeah. Autumn Cannibalism.
should we start with the opening credits?
Yes, let's.
Because they are very unusual in the sense that it starts with this very non-comedic apocalyptic scene, some rather shoddy model work of sort of what is supposed to be a decimated city after a nuclear fallout. Then they throw up like newspaper headlines, newspaper clippings, which are essentially catching you up on what happened in the previous episode because it is an ongoing narrative. And there's this ominous music, and we zoom in slowly onto a woman selling mushrooms, sort of small mushroom.
She looks like the sort of person who would be selling poppies. That's kind of the vibe.
Yeah, it says "Wear your mushroom with pride."
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, okay, let's talk about the opening titles. Firstly, the intent, and then we can go on to the realisation. So,
is the idea that even in a sort of post-apocalyptic world, she's still saying, yes, we're here.
We're number one. We won the war.
Yeah, I don't know what it quite means.
I think that's probably what it is.
There is obviously at the very, very end of the show, literally the last image of the last episode, which I will now spoil for you all if you haven't watched it, that this woman is in fact the First Lady. It's the president's wife. And in the very last image of the show, the president is kind of phones his wife, tells her to go into the nuclear bunker, and then we sort of slowly pan across to a picture of him and his wife, and it's the woman we've seen. So that's the payoff. 6 episodes later.
I mean, that's generous.
I'm not sure what it adds though. Yeah.
Can we just talk about the realisation? You said some shoddy model work.
Yes.
And it is very, very cheap, isn't it?
Yeah. The show itself had a very large budget, sort of twice that of a regular sitcom at the time, because of kind of all the different aspects they needed and the different sets and all location shooting and lots of things like that. So it was quite an expensive production. So yeah, why did the model work come out so shoddy? Because I feel like
it's really bad.
I don't know. I honestly don't know.
The other thing is, and this is the headlines, the spinning newspaper headlines.
Yeah.
I paused it and read them. So, the first headline is, Saudi coup, West reels. But then the story underneath the headline is about Barry Manilow fans turning out at Heathrow Airport, summoning memories of Beatlemania.
So it's not a joke Easter egg article, it's just
it's so cheap that they've just taken an actual newspaper article and just changed the headline and stuck the headline on top of it. The third headline is, US denies plan to restore Shah. And then the story under that is, as a quote, a businessman who claims his Asian wife was made to have a virginity test before entering Britain is suing the Home Office.
That's funnier than most of the material.
Yeah. But that's a genuine story in the newspapers of the 1980s.
But yeah, so we have that opening sequence, the opening credits, which is not very sitcom-y. But then we immediately go into a second opening credit sequence, which is completely different and is a very kind of 1980s American Dallas, basically, is what it's parodying. Upbeat music and kind of close-up shots of all our main characters. Can't decide which opening you want, have to. So just before we get into the details of the episode, I'd like to give a very important credit here to Jonathan Sloman.
Okay.
He wrote a booklet that accompanies the DVD and is essentially the entire history of the show and the history of it.
Oh, wow.
Which makes it a lot easier for someone like me when you really want to do the research.
Oh, okay.
Obviously, I've looked at lots of different things, but his work really brings it all together. So I'm referring to that quite a lot. So I just want to credit that straight away, Jonathan Sloman. And when I say booklet, it's 154 pages.
What? That's not a booklet?
That's a book, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
And let me tell you, goes into more detail than anyone than perhaps Jonathan Sloman could ever have wanted to know about Whoops Apocalypse. And has a really sort of detailed look at, because in the archives there's like the shooting script, there's rehearsal scripts, and so he literally breaks down the differences between every single bit of it, and it's quite painful in a lot of ways, but I read it nonetheless, and I want to thank him for his hard work. So let's jump into our episode, and we start with the Shah. We establish the Shah again, a little sort of catch-up of what had happened in the previous end of the previous episode, in which the Shah is expelled from France and then is blown up. Well, here's the interesting point, is that this was originally, in the writing, supposed to be the Shah of Iran, who has kind of escaped Iran.
Hang on. Is it not the Shah of Iran?
It is not the Shah of Iran.
Oh.
This character is the brother of the dead Shah of Iran, who has been sort of living in exile. So it's still the same principle. The Americans want to put him back in power so that they can control him as a puppet, but he is supposed to be like the sort of feckless brother who doesn't really know that much and can be controlled, but also didn't commit like loads of horrible atrocities. So we can sort of laugh at him a bit easier.
Is that what it is, do you think? Because the Shah of Iran had died by the time this went out. By the time it was made. But he was not a universally popular figure.
Yes, but that's the idea. They thought if it was the actual Shah, how do we have fun with that? Because it is perhaps a bit too... Yeah.
Yeah, but the character in the show here is continually humiliated and belittled. It's not like they're aggrandizing him.
Yeah, but it was a decision made in pre-production to perhaps just tone it down a touch, and it's difficult to find comedy in these things.
Well, let's talk about the characterizations then. So we've got the Shah and his manservant. Yes. So the Shah is played by is he Persian, the actor?
Well, yes, Bruce Montague, who is not really known for sitcoms apart from his major role in Butterflies as the man who is trying to poach Wendy Craig.
The other man.
Yes. To Jeffrey Palmer, who we will see later.
Was he a dramatic actor then, Bruce Montague?
Yes, primarily. Yeah, this is straight off the back of Butterflies, really. I mean, that was... Okay. So that had raised his profile quite considerably in general. And Butterflies, as we've talked about before, it's not exactly a hardcore gag-thon, is it? It's fairly straight in his characters. But, it's a character that, is the other man and could be sort of seen as a bad guy. And he plays it with such a character and humour that people always liked him. And so perhaps that's what they were kind of going for here.
Well, I think he's playing here a sort of pompous, grandiose character, a cockerel of a man, who is constantly belittled and, gets stuff poured on him. And you just, it's a very slapstick physical... Well, it's supposed to be a very Well, I guess it is a very slapstick physical performance, which is why I don't like it.
What you're saying is it's supposed to be funny.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, yeah.
And then, of course, we have David Kelly as Abdab. His
Abdab. I think you said that wrong, because what you just said there sounded very racist.
No, of course not.
Abdab. So this is the Shah's manservant, Abdab, and he's played by again. Was that an Arabian name?
Yeah, David Kelly, Arabian via Ireland.
This is so sixth form. And the thing about David Kelly's character is that he's blindfolded.
Yes.
Because he doesn't want to lay his eyes upon the precious Shah, because the Shah is the son of God and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's it. The whole blindfolded thing, it's a one-note joke, which I was sort of hoping would stop after the first episode.
They did 6 episodes. They keep playing and playing and playing.
Yeah, and I was waiting for it to go somewhere. I was really waiting for him to finally take the blindfold off, and it turns out he was actually blind.
see, Alan, that's funny. That's genuinely funny.
But it still would only have been one gag. But that would have been one more, at least.
But of course, so he's got this blind manservant who's continually spilling coffee on him and throwing things in the wrong place. And it's just, it's one joke.
It's the same joke over and over again, yeah. But David Kelly, though, he's got a long sitcom pedigree. We've seen him, of course, in...
Is he in Fawlty Towers? Is he the builder in Fawlty Towers?
The Irish builder in Fawlty Towers, of course he is. He was also a regular in Robin's Nest as the one-armed dishwasher. Slinger's Day, he was a regular in that. And had a bit of a resurgence in his later career. Do you remember Waking Ned? It's sort of like a pastoral Irish film.
I do, and yes, I can picture him in that, yes.
He was one of the major characters in that, which kind of rejuvenated him as like, he's an old man a character now. And off the back of that, or off the back of the kind of increased fame, I guess, that comes with that sort of thing, he then ended up playing Grandpa Joe in the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory remake that Tim Burton did. You know, the one with Johnny Depp.
Yeah, do you know what? That rings a bell as well. Now you've said it, I can picture that. Yeah, yeah.
He's the grandpa in it who goes around. Pretty major role for someone in their 70s. You know, it's sort of a bit of a late career resurgence. So, you know, he's well known. Honestly, I think he's the same in everything I've ever seen him in. I'm not including this where he's playing a totally different character to, like, say, Fawlty Towers, for example. But it's broad comedy, I guess, and that's what we're doing here.
Shall we talk about? Can I give you a bit of context here? The actual Shah of Iran and all that sort of backstory. So what we are satirising here, the real story, is that the Shah of Iran was equivalent to the King of Iran. You might think that he was the last in a long line of Shahs of Iran, but actually he was the second. His father was basically a general in the Iranian army who had been Shah, but then he wasn't quite compliant enough during the war, and so they overthrew him and put his son in place. His son, the Shah of Iran that we all know and love. So, you know, it's not like a centuries-old dynasty. It's a military coup, really. But so he was essentially a puppet. He was in charge. He was backed by the British and the Americans, and the oil flowed, and everyone was happy. He managed to suppress an outbreak of democracy in the 50s. Listeners might have heard of Mossadegh. He was the sort of Iranian prime minister who was trying to get more on democracy, and nobody liked that. The CIA kind of backed her. Well, it's not a coup because the Shah was already in charge, but, you know, they got rid of that outbreak of democracy. But he was very unpopular. Like, he was seen as an autocrat by the Iranian population. And eventually, during the 70s, there was more and more dissatisfaction. And eventually this turned into the 1979 revolution, which was the Islamists that took over. The Ayatollah Khomeini led that revolution. And that's, you know, that regime still holds sway in Iran. So in 1979, he was essentially kicked out of Iran, and that's what we are seeing now. That's what we are satirising now. Nobody wanted him. So he went to Egypt, then Morocco, then the Bahamas, then Mexico. And while he was in Mexico, he got cancer and needed treatment. And so he wanted to go to America. Jimmy Carter, that was the president of America, would not have him, didn't want him in the country, didn't want to have the problem. So they sent a doctor to Mexico to treat him. And then, basically, he ended up having to come to America for treatment. And that's what led to the storming of the US Embassy in Tehran. So if anyone's seen the film Argo with Ben Affleck, so the Iranians took all those Americans hostage. And that was in response to the Americans treating the Shah for cancer. Mexico wouldn't have him back after the treatment, so he went to Panama, and then eventually he moved to Egypt. But this all happened fairly quickly. He died in 1980, so he died before this was made, before Whoops Apocalypse was made.
But that was kind of while it was all being written and being put into place, which is, you know, perhaps partially why they changed this to the brother of the Shah.
Yeah.
So in the context of this show, the Shah has died. The Americans want to get his brother so that they can put him back in puppetry place.
But the joke is that nobody wants him. So the French don't want him, the British don't want him on British soil. The Americans want to get him back to Iran, but they can't. He's stranded on a P&O ferry in between. Because, of course, it's the 80s, so there's a strike. The ferrymen are on strike.
Well, actually, what happens here is the Americans are going to take him in. They blow up the ship so that everyone thinks he's dead, so they can do it in secret, and therefore it's not a problem. And the Conservative government of Britain are going to take him in. They've agreed, it's no problem.
Yeah.
Then what happens is a newsreader with no top on tells us that there has been an unexpected victory to... Actually, I'll tell you what she says. You were distracted with what she says is that, oh, look at these polls. The Labour is in third, Conservatives are in second, and the Social Democrat Alliance have got a strong lead. And that's the joke, that the Social Democrat Alliance are going to win the election. Well, later on, we get the line, here's some breaking news. The Labour have won a marginal victory in the election. And then we get introduced to our characters, which we'll talk about in a minute. Yeah, well, what's the joke there? What's going on?
We'll get in a bit, we'll get to the British Labour cabinet. But so the context is this. The 1970s had been first the Heath Conservatives, then the Wilson and Callaghan Labour government. And Margaret Thatcher had won election in 1979. The Labour Party now had this period of opposition, and they veered to the left, and they elected Michael Foot as their leader. So when we see Peter Jones later, he's satirising Michael Foot. So Michael Foot was a left-winger, and you may have heard the phrase "the longest suicide note in history." That was the 1983 election manifesto. Now, of course, this was written before that manifesto, but the point is that Michael Foot was seen as this loony left person, a la Jeremy Corbyn, I suppose. So in that period, a lot of the more centrist Labour Party cabinet members or former cabinet members broke away to form the SDP, the Social Democratic Party. So you had Roy Jenkins and Shirley Williams. There was a gang of four who broke away, David Owen, and they formed this political party, and it seemed like it was a really big thing. They won some by-elections, they got MPs, they were leading in the polls, so not quite by the same margin that we saw there, but they had really great poll results. And then the 1983 election came along, and essentially they got wiped out. You know, they won a handful of seats, and that was the beginning of the end. But again, this was written before the 1983 election. So when this was written, they were riding high in the polls. So I think it's quite prescient of the writers actually to say, if it turns out in a general election, they haven't got a chance.
The funny thing, the odd thing is that it just gets thrown away. It's like, and Labour won a narrow victory, even though we just saw the polls, they had 16.8% of the vote. Like, what happened?
You're absolutely right. It is thrown away. It's not like a major, it's just like, okay, here we are. Here's Michael Foot and his cronies. What they're satirising here, as we go, not just this episode, but as we go through the series, Kevin Pork is the Prime Minister's name that Peter Jones plays. So this Michael Foot proxy, essentially what he does is he leaves NATO and he joins the Warsaw Pact. He thinks he's Superman. He's obviously mentally unstable. And, you know, it's, again, house brick satire of what people imagined Michael Foot would do were he given the levers of power.
Well, shall we jump straight to our introduction to the British contingent, who are introduced here in this episode? And we open on them sat in Prime Ministerial office.
Yep.
Silence, the clock ticks. They sit there in silence for a while. And basically the joke of what's happened is...
It's quite funny, actually.
They've come in, they've gone, well, we'll nationalise this, shut that down, put that money into this, and everything's
sorted.
We'll
save £1,000 billion.
Yeah, exactly. They've had a cabinet meeting for 10 minutes. They did the minutes on the back of a fag packet.
Literally the back of a fag packet. So he says, just read the minutes again. And Richard Davies pulls out a packet of silk cut and he's reading the notes off the back of it. And then what I liked is, as he ran out of space, he pulled out the foil in the cigarette packet and there was some more notes on there, which was a bit of nostalgia for me. Like, it's a long time since I pulled the foil off a packet of cigarettes.
Yeah. It's a nice gag. It sort of goes on a bit too long.
Yes, of course.
But yeah, and then the sort of joke is like, well, we've done it now. It only took 10 minutes. What were the last lot doing?
Yeah.
We figured it out.
I think we are satirising political naivety there. I think the idea is that these loony lefties think, all you got to do is nationalise everything. It's as simple as that. And of course, it's a bit more complicated than that.
Is it that much more complicated than that?
Well, I think, we'll talk about the Russian side of things in a moment, but it's only more it's not more complicated than that if you just, have a whitewashed wall and a firing squad to deal with people who don't go along with you.
So that establishes our characters. We have Peter Jones as the Prime Minister, Kevin Pork, brilliant comedy name. I'm sure that's hilarious somewhere. But then we have our Foreign Secretary played by Geoffrey Palmer and the Chancellor played by Richard Davies.
So we've got some proper sitcom heritage in that room.
Exactly, yes. We talked about Richard Davies very recently when we did Please Sir, which is probably still his most well-remembered role. But yeah, you want a fiery Welshman? You got it.
And there are a few moments in this where it is, he's funny because it's Welsh.
Yeah. He's
not, the lines he's delivering are that funny, but isn't his accent good? There's a bit of that.
He's good, though. He does deliver everything very well. In fact, I would say this whole bits are my favourite bits, the British bits. Geoffrey Palmer, of course, as the Foreign Secretary, who ends up going to Russia and dealing with that element of things.
Geoffrey Palmer's he's very Geoffrey Palmer, though, isn't he? He's sort of playing it quite straight.
Yes, which I think is nice. I think it just provides the balance to what Peter Jones is doing. But this is Geoffrey Palmer again, off of Butterflies, is really what people are going to say, that's who Geoffrey Palmer is, because it's before, as time goes by and all that sort of stuff, which is perhaps better known now. But yeah, he is the stuffed shirt. Like, he plays that very well. And interestingly enough, both of these guys were in Fawlty Towers, but they were both in the same episode of Fawlty Towers.
Yes. I'm a doctor and I want my sausages.
Yeah. But Richard Davies is one of the other frustrated guests.
Of course he is, yes.
We have also talked about Peter Jones in quite some detail because we have dealt with the rag trade, which...
The rag trade, of course.
...was certainly, at the time, his best-known work. By this point, obviously, he's a bit older. He's a bit of an elder statesman of the sitcom world, of comedy world.
So he reveals in this scene that he thinks he's Superman. And then in a later episode, we get all three of these guys in superhero outfits, which is, all very silly.
Yes.
But the point I was about to make was, there's a scene with Peter Jones, like in full Superman gear with the tights and the underpants outside his tights and all that sort of thing. And he looks like a confused old man. it feels abusive.
Maybe it's just excellent acting.
Maybe. No, but the point that set me off on that tangent was that you said, he's a bit older now, and he is. That's fine. People get older, but yeah, he looks like a little old man in that Superman outfit.
Peter Jones, of course, we knew him from the rag trade, but when we talked about him then, we also picked out where you really knew him from your childhood, Gareth, which was
the voice of the book in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Yes.
So that's kind of what he was known to by the sort of the young people of the day.
That would be about this time, wouldn't it? Was that early 80s?
Yes, yeah, that kind of period. And Douglas Adams, of course, was a contemporary of Marshall and Renwick and John Lloyd and those sorts of people. He came up through that whole process, weekending, BBC Radio. So they knew him. In fact, here's a little bit of trivia for you. Apparently, and this comes from very reliable sources, Andrew Marshall is the inspiration for Marvin the Paranoid Android.
Okay, that's pretty good. I mean, that's not something you'd want to tell people about, but that's quite funny.
So that was based on him, and there's all sorts of other connections between the two worlds, and they often kind of satirized each other in their radio work and that sort of thing. But yeah, Peter Jones was known as that, and he would talk all this nonsense, the Hitchhiker's Guide type of silliness, and make it sound kind of nice and sensible, and that's kind of what he's doing here. He's a ridiculous character who's obviously slightly insane, but just makes it sound very wholesome and nice.
Oh, I'm sorry. I saw something rather interesting with my telescopic and X-ray vision. The new Shah of Iran isn't dead at all. He's on a cross-channel ferry bound for Dover at this very moment.
Didn't you get a memo from MI5 telling you that this morning?
Yes, I left it upstairs in my in-tray. I was just reading it.
Did you notice this scene is in the office of the Prime Minister, number 10 Downing Street, and there's a sort of peeling Che Guevara poster on the wall. Did you see that? Yes. Which is, again, very of its time. Like, I think in the early 80s, there was probably somewhere between 70 and 80% of all students would have had a peeling poster of Che Guevara on the dormitory wall.
I also noticed a jar of Nescafe Gold Blend on the table.
Nescafe Gold Blend, proper coffee. None of that Brazilian muck.
Just while we talk about these characters, shall we jump to the next scene where we see them?
Yes.
Probably my favourite moment where the Prime Minister, still believing he's Superman, brings Crypto the Superdog in, which is a dog with a red cape on, which is, of course, of Superman lore, and says, I'll just send him out for his fly around the block, and just lobs him out of the window.
Yeah, that was funny. That's funny. There's a good sort of comic book line as well, where he says, I've just been to the doctor, and Jeffrey Palmer and Richard Davis say, thank God for that, because obviously he's losing his mind, he's been to the doctors. Yes, Dr. Destiny of Earth 2. Which I presume is Marvel comic book lore. Oh, it's DC. Sorry, it's DC comic book lore. I don't really know who Dr. Destiny of Earth 2 is, but I sort of got it from context.
This is the interesting thing. David Renwick, apparently, as a young man or child, was really into his comic books and read all the DC comics. Right. And so it's his influence. And so all this stuff with the Green Lantern and Bird Person or whatever Jeffrey Palmer is, it's all legit. All the little references are correct. And, this is pre the superhero film boom of the early 2000s.
Well, it's post-Superman. Superman as a film had been out, Christopher Reeve.
Well, that's why that's your headline one. But the likes of the Green Lantern, you have to read the comic books to be getting that.
I didn't know the references. I didn't know Crypto the Superdog either. We talked a little bit about the Shah. Shall we just go back and kind of complete that arc for the show here? Okay. So that first scene, we didn't really talk about what happens in that scene. He's leaving France, and there's an angry mob of 8 extras sort of shouting him off the harbour, which is quite funny and close. Which is quite good in close up. You've got these sort of angry people shouting towards the camera, and then why do they do a long shot of it when you can see it's just 8 extras? Like, that's not a mob. Also, did you see what makes them French? Did you see what makes that mob French? One of them, they've decided. No, they're like, oh god, they filmed it and they thought, oh, hang on a minute, we're supposed to be in France here. So they've given them one of the men a beret, but they obviously didn't have a proper beret, so it's actually one of those Jimmy hats that you buy in Edinburgh gift shops. It's got a little pom pom on top. It's near enough, no one will know.
And that, of course, is a sort of a continuation of what happens in the first episode, in which the French ambassador throws him out of France. And there's a whole procedure of this nonsense of him like whacking him with a stick of asparagus and stuff. It's very Python-esque and very poor, and goes
very
on far
racist,
too long.
Very poor.
And you know, we all know this. We all 60 years later, we can all accept and say that Python was extremely hit and miss, as all sketch shows are. And so, you know, it's good. We've got the 10 bits that we all like and we can quote, but the rest of it was just stupid, surreal nonsense. And that seems to be the bit that Marshall and Renwick have chosen to emulate here.
Well, okay, so let's spin through the rest of the episode and to our visits to the Shah. So, as I say, we see the boat explode, which is a fake death. Actually, he's on this P&O ferry, and he's terribly seasick. We get lots of physical humour. There's things being thrown over him, coffee poured over him. It's just lame, Alan. It's really lame.
Yeah, I'll give you that. And in fact, in the introductory scene where we see him in the toilet, he's hiding in the toilet, there is another man stood at the urinal. And he obviously realised something's going on and is so distracted that he pisses on his shoes. Yeah. But it just doesn't play. It gets a good laugh from the audience, so maybe it was more obvious.
Yeah, it didn't work
but
for me
the way
either.
it's filmed, I guess you can't show a man pissing on his shoes, so it sort of shows his face and then cuts to his shoes that might be wet, but it's not that obvious in the lighting, and it's just...
Agreed.
There's a lot of that sort of thing. There's another bit where Jeffrey Palmer is so shocked by what Peter Jones is saying that he's pouring a cup of tea and just, you know, is so stunned that the tea just keeps pouring and it all spills over the cup. Again, doesn't really play, you don't see what's happening. There's a lot of things that don't hit in the way that they're obviously supposed to.
Well, I was watching this episode with Rachel, my better half, and that scene where the guy pees on his shoes, it sort of showed his shoes, and like you say, you couldn't really see what's going on here. Yeah. And she's like, what just happened? I think he's peed on his shoes. And she said, oh, is that a thing that happens a lot? And I went, not really. No. We just had this whole conversation about how disgusting urinals are. and you know, the whole moment was just a nothing.
Yeah. So can we cut to the later scene with the Shah in which the SAS turn up?
The SAS. So yeah, basically the SAS come in. I can't remember. Is the plan to kill the Shah, or is it?
No, they're just going to make sure he doesn't get into the country. So they're just going to hold him on the ferry, basically.
But the joke here is that they're all gung ho and they just come in firing, and everyone gets shot, including one of their own.
Yeah, and again, my vibe off this scene particularly, but it does kind of go for a lot of the other stuff as well. It's too long. It's one joke strung out for 4 minutes.
Yep.
And it's shoddy. It doesn't quite work. There's a lot of things that don't work. It feels like a sketch. Do you know what? It feels like a sketch. I mean, everything feels like a sketch.
It feels like a bad sketch, though, doesn't it?
But it reminded me... Do you ever watch Saturday Night Live, the American show?
Yes, and I have strong feelings about how bad that is as well.
Yeah, because it's obviously all written quite short notice. They haven't had a chance to learn the lines, and you know the physical rehearsal hasn't been much. This is a very physical scene, and it's all really shoddy. So there's one bit where one of the SAS men has to kick his foot through a door, the toilet cubicle door, and then the gag is that he gets his foot stuck in it.
Takes him 2 or 3 goes, doesn't it?
He kicks it, it cuts to a close-up of the other side of the door and doesn't come through because it just doesn't get through it. Cut to the main shot again and his foot's in the door. And then he goes, oh, my foot's shut. But that is compounded by the fact that, you know, that's the third door that he kicks down, you know, because there's anarchy before we get to that point. The second door that he kicks, he gets his foot caught in it, and he obviously has to struggle to get it out. So the whole thing just doesn't work. It was just like, we really need to do that again, but, you know, we haven't got the doors, so. Did
you pick up the thing that they've all got? All their names begin with D. I quite like that detail. Yeah. So the guy who founded the SAS was David Sterling, and I guess that's the reference. But
is that it?
You know, they were called Dennis, Desmond, and Donald, which feel like SAS names. I can't really tell you why, but that worked for me. That was a good detail.
Yeah, the scene itself kind of works on its own level, but just goes on too long. They randomly shoot at the cubicle, killing one of their own men. But then the Shah and Abdab are in there as well, but they don't notice.
I wish you wouldn't say Abdab. It feels like we're being racist.
That's the character's name. And then, so earlier on, the Shah has got a suit that Abdab has found for him that is obviously ill-fitting. It's too big for him. And then in this scene, he comes out and it's far too small.
Shrunk.
It's shrunk.
Yeah, it's shrunk.
Any
Don't know
ideas why?
No idea. No. We stopped the video and talked about that last night. No idea.
I was hoping
no
you
idea.
might
But
come
what
up
I
with
will
something.
tell you is this. He walks out and he's got a little sort of pork pie hat on and this suit that's too tight for him. He looks like Mickey Pearce from Only Fools and Horses. He looks like a fat bloke doing an impression of Mickey Pearce. Going to a fancy dress party is Mickey Pearce. That's what he looks like.
Okay.
Watch it again, I'm telling you.
So, shall we address what happens with the Shah?
Yeah, so that's the end of him in this episode, isn't it? But yeah, like, how does the story play out for the rest of the series?
Well, he stays he's trapped on the ferry for a long time. Ultimately, the Americans get him off the ferry, but then they put him onto a space shuttle, which then launches into space, and to go right to the very end. Because of their antics and Abdab blindfoldedly pressing buttons, the shuttle crashes down into Earth and is mistaken by the Russians for a nuclear missile. And so they launch a counterattack. Whoops! It's an apocalypse!
Apocalypse!
So it all ties in. It all makes perfect sense.
That's very far-sighted writing, isn't it?
And I think the idea is the Americans put him on the shuttle just to kind of keep him out of the way for a while.
Yeah, well, it's an extension. The joke is it's an extension of this nobody wants him on their soil. Let's just launch him into space for crying out loud.
Yeah. The actual characters themselves, those two, they end as they begin. There is no change in their characters. There is no change in the joke that we consistently do with them. It is exactly the same throughout. Yeah. And that is quite painful.
It never develops. It's tiresome. It's tiresome by the end of the first scene we see them in.
Yes.
Okay, so look, I'm looking back at my notes for the episode. So after the first Shah scene, we actually get an advert. A fake advert. So let's talk about that, and then we can talk about more generally. So this is an advert for a girdle, and who is in this advert? A very recognisable face.
Carmen Silvera from Allo Allo, before Allo Allo, of course, and so she was just an actor. and here's the other interesting thing: she is of Canadian origin, or at least partly. So I
did not know that.
So there's loads of actors in this that are in one way or another, American or can do an American accent. And so this was the way it was done back in those days. Apparently British people can't do American accents. They can do Indian accents, Arabian accents, no problem. But they can't do American accents. So
it would be offensive to try.
So what you do is you get the 12 American actors who live in London and they're in everything. And this goes straight to Aliens, for example, which was shot in Britain. But the actors are in that are like, oh, I saw him in Goodnight Sweetheart or something, It's And so anytime you want an American actor, an American character, you go to the handful of actors that are there. Mm-hmm. And Carmen Silvera apparently was one of them. She was Canadian, actually, but who knows?
I genuinely didn't know that. I know she's doing an accent here, but I just thought she was a British actress doing an accent.
Well, the name, I guess, is she Spanish of some kind? I don't know. But of course.
But the thing is, now I think about it, because she's got the cod French accent in LOL, I've got no idea what a real voice is
like. Her natural accent is, of course, French. But so there's lots of American actors in this. But I think the joke is that what we're seeing of the Iranian Shah being blown up is actually a newscast, an American newscast, and it cuts to an advert and then cuts back to the news reader. Yeah. The idea being that, even in moments of great national news, they'll still cut to an advert for something completely unrelated. I think that's the gag, isn't it?
In the 80s, I do remember this actually, the idea that the Americans just had adverts everywhere was a thing. That was a trope, because presumably we didn't in quite the same way.
Yes.
I don't feel like that plays anymore. I think we're all the same now in terms of commercialisation of public spaces.
Especially as this was on LWT, so it wasn't like it was a BBC show, which would make more sense.
Yeah.
Let's a little word on Newsreader then, who, is a kind of expositionary character. Yeah. He catches us up on what's happening and talks in this very quick-fire American way.
We've just heard of yet another false nuclear alert among NATO forces in the Middle East. For a full 3.5 seconds yesterday morning, it was believed the world was at war. Releasing details of the incident, a Pentagon spokesman said the alarm was triggered by a numerical overload of a Space Invaders machine in the pilot's mess room. However, there was no danger. Repeat, however, there was no danger of any escalation, and the alert never got beyond computer stage, and certainly no nuclear bombers whatsoever got halfway to Russia and then had to turn back again.
Again, another American actor based in Britain. I quite like it. They use it as an opportunity to drop a lot of political satire in, but also a few little gags and one-liners, or very almost two Ronnie's-esque newsreader kind of gags. I think the way he speaks in a very quick-fire American newsreader kind of way is kind of a nice bit, but does obscure the timing of some of the comedy and loses some of it.
Yeah.
Well, that's all we have time for this week, I'm afraid, but come back next time where we will be carrying on our discussion of Whoops Apocalypse. We'll be talking about Richard Griffiths, and we'll be looking into the film version of Whoops Apocalypse, which is not really a spin-off exactly, just more of a different treatment of the same material, but an interesting conversation to be had there. So, in the meantime, do contact us on social media at BritCompod. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time.